smooth, that actually uses this mesh as the base for, as I said, a sort of NURB-like surface. And now if I go and actually put up the iterations, I'll just turn on isoline display, which keeps the display a bit simpler. And if I do a render now, you'll notice that this teapot isn't segmented anymore. You'll actually see that it's a lot smoother, as you can see here. So it's creating a derived surface from that underlying mesh. So in effect, the surface is implied. It's gone from being an explicit surface into more of an implicit surface. So now that we know what the implicit and explicit geometry types are, and that we have both of these in 3ds Max, let's quickly run through the base geotypes. On the left, we have the most basic object type in 3ds Max, and that's a primitive. And as we described earlier, that's actually a mathematical description of an object using curves, and it's actually quite akin in many ways to the patch model, which you can see over here, or a NURB-like model here. Then next to it, we have an editable mesh, and the editable mesh is the core geometry type in 3ds Max, along with editable splines. The editable mesh is simply an explicit polygonal surface that's made up of vertices, edges, and triangular faces, and we'll quickly have a look at that. These blue dots here, they're actually the vertices, and I can select the vertices here. And then if I go to edge mode, these lines here are actually edges, which you can see they actually make up the faces of our polygon. I better turn on ignore back facing actually, because it's selecting the back faces of the teapot. There you go. So those are the edges, and I can actually select in the middle of a face, and you can see it's actually selecting an edge there, which is hidden. And this is one of the defining factors between the differences between an editable mesh and an editable poly. So you can see you've always got edges in the middle of faces. And the reason for these edges is, you can see we've got a geometry type here called a triangle. And you can see we can actually select these triangular faces. And the basic thing to remember about an editable mesh in 3ds Max is that it's always made up of triangles, even if you see these faces shown here. Now, the reason why these faces are shown as square, or rectangular I should say, is because the edge here is actually hidden. And you can actually do that explicitly with an editable mesh. You can go down here and you can say let's make this invisible, and now that actual edge is hidden. So it's actually just a display optimization. In reality, the actual surface is made up of triangles, and you can see if I select these faces here, these edges here, you can actually see all these edges show up, so they are really there. Now let's quickly look at a spline, which I'll quickly create here. I'll just create a couple of these. And you've got these tools here for drawing splines quickly. You can draw an arc, n-gon, a donut, and so on. Now the editable spline was the second original core geotype in 3ds Max, and the spline is a parametric implicit curve type. Due to its defining a curve through space, the spline can be used to define an animation path, and it's also used in a number of implicit object types such as a loft, the lathe, the extrusion, and so on. And it can also actually be used to define a patched base surface. If we have a look at the editable patch, which I think is this object here, let's have a look. Editable poly, editable mesh, editable patch, there we go. Now this surface is actually made up of spline-like segments and control points, and you can think of these control points are a little bit like vertices, and they make up points on a curve. These are basically like splines, and they go around and they form patches. Now you can have two types of patches. You can see you've got a quad patch here, which is in other words a patch made up of 4 edges, And you can also have tri-patches in 3ds Max, and that's a patch obviously made up with 3 edges to make up a triangular patch surface. And I think you can actually see these here. So these are, looks like these are tri-patches. You can see you've got 1 edge, 2 edges, 3 edges here. So this is a patch-based surface, and it's a kind of parametric-based surface, and as we said earlier, what that means is that it's made up, you can actually, its form is kind of implicit. It's mathematical in nature because you've got these mathematical curves. And as a result of that, you can have a viewport representation of the patch, which you will put down to 0. So you can see there's the basic patch definition, and that's where you're actually using no subdivisions along the length of these curves. So you get these lines instead of nice curves. But you can put that value up and get a much nicer representation. And you also got a render representation, which obviously doesn't come into play until you render the object. And if we do that, you can see you get a nice smooth rendered object at render time. Then if we go back into the world of curves again, we look at a new type of curve that was actually added in, I believe it was 3ds Max 2. And you can see we've got these shapes options here. The default shape option is splines, but if you look down, you've got NURBS curves as well. We'll just quickly create some point curves. And we'll create a CV curve as well. Now, the NURBS curve is similar to the Bezier curve in that it's a parametric implicit curve through space. Again, NURBS curves can be used for defining animation curves, but in this case they can only be used to define NURBS-based surfaces. Now, at the end of our row here, if we go into wireframe again, you can see we've got our NURBS-based surfaces, and you can see they're actually quite similar to patch surfaces. But those who are familiar with Maya or Rhino will know that NURBS surfaces have, qualities all of their own. We can go in and we can, select surfaces here. As you can see, we've got some control points here we can move around in this surface. Select surfaces here, curves. As you can see here, this is some kind of sweep, so we can actually redefine that shape. And now if we render that, we'd actually get a slightly deformed, differently shaped teapot, as you can see. Now, more recently, I think it was in Max 4.5, not quite sure actually, but a new type of object was added, and that was called the editable poly. And as I said, it's a recent addition, and its creation came about when it became clear that the editable mesh design was not actually ideal for subdivision modeling. It had become apparent during Autodesk's development of tools for polymodeling that features of the editable mesh design really bogged them down and limited the software designer's plans. The editable poly was produced to remedy that situation. And the edit polys have no limits on the number of sides to a face. So in the editable mesh case, we knew that we have 3 edges to every face. So in other words, everything is built up of triangles. But in this case, you can have polygonal faces with as many sides as you want. So it truly is a polygonal mesh. Also, changes were made to the internal database system so that it made it much faster to query which faces and edges were adjacent to others. And this also allowed for a much faster sub-D workflow. So, as you can see, there are a number of base geotypes in 3ds Max, and for the most part, it's possible to convert between them using the quad menu. So we could go here, convert to editable mesh. You can see it's an editable mesh now. We can convert back to editable poly. It's now an editable poly. But if we now convert it to an editable patch, it would actually have lots and lots and lots of patches.